Welcome to another edition of Radio Influencers, a podcast series we're doing for Radio Update. I'm your host, Andy Meadows. I want to focus on something timely this week, but first, let's go over the results of our recent Radio Update Weekly Wire polls. On last week's episode, we talked about my process for air checking talent and doing the occasional deep dive. So on Wednesday's poll, we ask, how often are your on-air talent air checked? Weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually, or never? A little better results than I expected, but still kind of disheartening. Out of the radio decision makers who responded, the number one answer was quarterly with 21.7%. Monthly was a close second with 20.3%. Weekly and never tied for third at 19.6%. Annually came in last at 18.9%. So kind of split results, but it's disappointing that 38.5% of talent are air checked once a year or less. We're recording this on a Sunday, but we have already had a decent response to our Weekend Wire poll question. How much do you adjust your programming for summer? And this one was a little more positive. A lot was number one with 36.8%, followed by some at 35.8% and very little at 27.4%. That question was inspired by another strong programming article from my friend John Lund called Get Your Summer On Radio Update, which includes his summer programming checklist. We had some big news this past week in the Meadows house. We now have a full starting five, and this one might bump me out of my role at the low post because he was born 22 inches long. That's almost 3/4 inches longer than I was born at, not that we're counting. Jack Lewis Meadows was born on May 7th at 12:43 p.m. Both mom and baby are happy and healthy, but anyone who tells you that 3 isn't a lot harder than 2 doesn't have 3 kids under 4. Jack's birth kind of led me into today's topic because as a second-generation radio guy, it naturally got me thinking about what the radio industry will look like when Jack starts looking for a career, starts thinking about having a career. Long ways off, obviously, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little worried about what radio will look like by then. I'm not typically one for doom and gloom. People have been declaring radio dead for the past 20 years, but I do think we're at an inflection point. New FCC Chair Brandon Carr is reportedly considering deregulation. It's anyone's guess as to whether that will actually happen, but in the event it does, it wouldn't make the big groups bigger like it would have a couple of years ago. It would just create a situation where smaller operators would end up owning all the stations in some markets, in my opinion. I'm not crazy about the lack of competition that would create and the ramifications of that lack of competition, but it might not be a bad thing overall. The fact is, with each passing year, there are less people who know how to operate stations at the local level. So letting one capable local operator have them all might make sense. The really big groups aren't in a position to add stations, nor do they have an appetite to do so because of the debt they're all carrying. Radio isn't scalable, at least not the way they've traditionally chosen to scale it, cutting as much cost as possible at the local level. Because that ends up removing the thing that radio needs to be successful, talented and capable local personnel. What radio needs to do is invest at the local level, and the only people I see doing this are the small and medium-sized independent groups. It used to be rare to see a smaller independent group beat the big groups ratings and revenue-wise, but over the past few years, I've seen lots of examples of that happening in market after market. That's happening because local revenue is the determining factor in the survival of stations, groups, and our industry at large, to be honest. And stations and groups that invest at the local level are significantly more likely to win at the local level as long as they're being strategic and smart with how they invest their time and their money. One thing I adamantly disagree with is that the large groups are struggling because of their digital-first strategy. If you consume this podcast or read anything I write, you know that I'm a big proponent of radio doing more on the digital front to extend our brands and help us soak up local digital dollars to make up for the lost terrestrial dollars. The massive groups are failing because of the debt they're carrying and the decisions they've made to try and manage that debt, namely cutting too severely at the local level. Digital first is an okay strategy, but you need digital savvy people at the local level to create the digital content needed to make legit digital dollars. As for the future of the gigantic groups, as the title of this episode indicates, I think it's a bleak one. No rule change is going to save the massive groups. The debt they're carrying because their stations were purchased at a 10x multiple that's never coming back, 5x or less is the present and future of radio valuations. A rule change that removes any remaining monopoly laws, allowing groups to buy as many stations as they want, won't help the massive groups because they're the ones who need to unload tons of stations, and nobody is buying radio stations in that volume anymore. People are absolutely still buying radio stations, but only a few at a time and very purposefully. Because of my somewhat general company name, Radio Station Consultant, I get a fair amount of calls and emails from first-time radio buyers, and the advice I always give them to the question of should I buy a radio station is this: do you know what you're going to do with it and who's going to run it? If the answer to either of those questions is no, then don't buy a radio station. Going forward, one of the best things for the health of our industry would be if instead of taking stations dark or abandoning them altogether, groups would sell those stations to someone who actually wants to run them for whatever they can get for it. What do you think? Are gigantic radio groups doomed, or am I overreacting? Email me at andy@radiostationconsultant.com or editor@radioupdate.com and let me know. As always, if you have some thoughts you'd like to share on this or any other hot radio topic, submit an article about it by emailing submissions at radioupdate.com. Thanks for listening, watching, and reading. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Radio Influencers. Radio Influencers is a Radio Update production. New episodes are released on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern.